This is Last Wild Places, a Patagonia Journal podcast where adventurers, conservationists, and other inspiring guests share their stories about nature's last frontiers. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode. I'm Lily Alford.
And I'm Jimmy Lehman, the executive editor of Patagonia Journal. In the Last Wild Places podcast, we will be exploring wild places around the world from a variety of perspectives: conservation, science, expeditions, adventures, indigenous peoples, outdoor sports, and more.
Today's guest is Leon McCarron, an explorer and journalist from Northern Ireland. Among his many outdoor adventures all over the planet, he has been a presenter for a BBC film about sailing in the Arctic, journeyed by bike from New York to Hong Kong, walked 3,000 miles across China for a 4-part National Geographic Asia series, and walked 1,000 miles through the largest sand desert on Earth. Now a consultant on developing hiking trails, Leon and his partner are based near the Zagro Mountains in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where he helped develop the trail network there and continues to assist the burgeoning local hiker community to keep those mountains protected, and is also at work planning the first long-distance hiking trail in Iraq.
Leon's amazing adventures have given him great insight into the beauty inherent in wild places and the need to protect them. Some of his adventures are featured in his 3 books: Wounded Tigress, A River Journey Through the Cradle of Civilization; The Land Beyond, 1,000 Miles on Foot Through the Middle East; and The Road Headed West, a cycling adventure through North America. We're excited to have him on the show.
Each episode, we also have the backstory, where we talk to the writers from each issue of the Patagonia Journal to get a deeper perspective on their stories. Today's backstory is with Jimena Martinez about her article Iceland, Heart of Ice and Fire from issue 27. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello, Leon McCarron. Welcome to the Last Wild Places podcast. We appreciate greatly that you're able to give us some time. You understand you're in Jordan, constantly traveling all over the Middle East. So we feel very honored to have you on the show. When I look over your career, it's pretty amazing all the places you've gone. You almost seem like a modern day Indiana Jones with all the things. You're a modern day adventurer like Indiana Jones. What inspired you to do all that? I mean, it's amazing all the things you've done. What inspired you as a young man to follow this amazing path you've gone down?
Well, and first, thank you for a number of things. Thank you for inviting me on, and thank you for comparing me to Indiana Jones. I think that's very generous. No, I mean, I've been really lucky. You know, I grew up in a very rural part of the north of Ireland, and I grew up on a farm. I didn't really leave the island until I went to Scotland a couple of times because I had family there, but I didn't really leave the British Isles, let's say, until after university. And I had this idea that I wanted to go and see some of the world before I, started into whatever career would take over the rest of my life. And but I wanted to do it slowly and really feel as much of it as I could. And I had this idea of getting a bicycle and just seeing how far I could ride it before I ran out of my savings. So when I finished studying, I saved up for a year. That was my pot of money to go off and ride my bike. I flew to New York City because that was just a city that it kind of felt familiar yet foreign to me. It was the same language, so I could start off with that. I mean, turns out the United States is incredibly foreign to someone coming from Ireland, but at least it seemed culturally familiar because I'd grown up with so much media and influence from the US. And then I just rode my bike, and it was an amazing experience. I lasted about a year and a half before my savings ran out, and I went home. But that showed me just the beauty and size of the world. It showed me how varied it is. It showed me how kind people are. It showed me how beautiful in so many different ways the world can be. And it showed me, in keeping with the theme of this podcast, it showed me where these wild places were and how they made me as a traveler, an outsider arriving into them feel, and also every single one of them felt somehow under attack, somehow diminishing, somehow shrinking, somehow being squeezed, and that really stuck with me as well. That I could ride my bike for 15,000 miles, 22,000 kilometers, something like that, and pass through all these incredible places, and still get a sense that we were losing so much. I was gaining so much personally, but I could see so much was getting lost in the world too. So anyway, I think that's what set me off. And then I've just avoided getting a real job ever since. And I started writing, I started making films, started trying to tell stories, and finding ways to turn it into a career as well as a passion. And that was kind of a scarily long time ago now. That was 2010. I set off my bike trip, so it's coming up to a decade and a half I've been doing this.
That's the bike trip. That's the subject of your book, The Road Headed West, a cycling adventure through North America. Is that the same?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
I only wrote about the first part of it simply because in the way in which I was traveling, I didn't feel like I was going deep enough to have any great insights about a lot of the later places I passed through in Southeast Asia and so on through into China. But I didn't speak any of those languages, so I was having quite a surface level interaction. But in that first part of the trip, I was, a young man kind of setting off across the United States at a pretty interesting time in the country. So that book was kind of I wanted it to do two things. I wanted it to be a rite of passage story of what happens if you set off on a bike and are pretty clueless and underprepared, but enthusiastic. And also to see this cross section of a country that I felt I knew, but which of course was so incredibly different in all sorts of ways. And so that was the first book, was just that first section.
How long did it take you to do that trip?
I think it took me to get across the United States and well, North America, because I went up and down into Canada a couple of times. I think it was about 3 to 4 months. So I was going pretty slow. I mean, some people do that in, I don't know, 9, 10 days, something like that. I was taking my time, stopping off places, because I was trying to make my budget last as long as possible. I was camping and mostly eating peanut butter that I bought from stores, like consignment stores where it was out of date. And, so I was living on $3-4 a day. And it was such a great sense of freedom. It was such a privilege to have that sense of freedom where I had everything I needed on the side of my bike. I could put up my tent anywhere. I had lentils and peanut butter and a few apples in the back of my panniers, and it was amazing. It was such a sense of freedom. So I was encouraged to go slowly.
Were you spending time in the cities, in the parks and cities? What kind of places were you seeing along the way?
I was seeing a little bit of everything. I think to begin with, I tried to plan my journey, and this was, I'm aware I'm increasingly sounding very old and also kind of a Luddite, but I didn't have a smartphone. I didn't have any technology with me on that trip. Smartphones weren't a thing yet, so I was just carrying paper maps that an organization called the Adventure Cycling Association in the US had produced, and that was helpful in kind of helping to route me onto smaller roads. And I looked initially to go into cities because I'd heard of them. I wanted to go into, even if it was smaller cities like Buffalo, New York, or Syracuse or whatever, at the start of the trip, I'd go into them. And then I realized that actually cycling in and out of cities was kind of a hassle. And as when you arrive in a city by car or by plane or whatever, you don't feel how a city grows. If you arrive by bicycle, or as I've done more in recent years on foot, you really see how industrial estates, agriculture blends into industrial estates, blends into suburbs, it blends into city center, and you feel all that, and it's kind of interesting, but it's noisy and busy and polluted. And so in the end, I would mostly just try and stick to smaller roads, smaller places, smaller communities. It was easier to meet people. And then certainly in the US, I just looked for the big national parks as well and tried to ride through as many of those as I could.
When I first started in the magazine, I came across something that you wrote about the Rio Santa Cruz. You did a trip with, I guess it was Tom Allen, is that right?
My friend Tom Allen and then an Argentinian friend called Jose Argento. Three of
Right.
us traveled together.
And I came across an article that you wrote for Sidetrack about
Mhm.
the last
Yeah.
explorers on the Santa Cruz. I was just reading it again recently and came across some interesting lines. You talked about the steppe, traveling the steppe on horseback. Sometimes the winds were 120 kilometers an hour at times. He said that's practically like a hurricane force. And you wrote, if this sounds miserable at times, then that's good. It often was. Misery, of course, is key to a successful expedition. Any fool can go to the other side of the world and be happy. There's a huge sense of reward to be had in pushing oneself to deal with and perhaps even thrive in such circumstances. It is so often the hardships that help illuminate clearly the beauty and wonder around us. That to me seems to encapsulate a lot of what it is about to go out into wild places. What did you learn from that trip and how did Patagonia affect you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for finding that and reading it. What strikes me is I definitely wrote that when I was a younger man. Um, the the desire to go and be miserable is maybe leaving me these days. But no, I think I I'd always wanted to. I mean, for as long as I could remember, I'd wanted to visit Patagonia. I had been very fortunate to visit Mongolia, which was the second expedition that I did. I walked with a friend, Rob Lilwall, from across the Gobi Desert in Mongolia and then down through China. And in my head, from my rural upbringing in Ireland, the two great wild places of the world were Mongolia and Patagonia, and so they held this special place in my imagination. And sometimes that's really what matters, right? Sometimes there's other great wild places I've since learned, but sometimes the perception is actually the key part. And for me, those were the the high point, the zenith of wilderness. So when I got an opportunity to go in 2014 to Patagonia, it was because I'd read just in passing a newspaper story about the Rio Santa Cruz, which was at the time the last large free-flowing glacial river in the Argentine side of Patagonia. And there was plans to build two enormous dams on it. And the construction was due to begin quite quickly. So I spoke to my friend Tom, who was a talented filmmaker, and at the time we didn't know Jose very well, but he was an experienced horseman and very passionate about his country. And the three of us, within a few weeks, decided to go and do it. Find a couple of outdoor brands to cover the costs, and we flew out. And we bought 5 horses, and we bought them in El Calafate, kind of which was the end point of the journey, and then we transported them out to the Atlantic coast and started to ride back upstream. And we were also following in the footsteps, I suppose, of Charles Darwin, who traveled up that river with Captain Fitzroy as part of the surveying expedition. And Darwin had left these diaries about his whole time on the Beagle, but quite detailed diaries about his journey up to Santa Cruz. And mostly he was quite miserable. He didn't really want to be an explorer. He kind of found all this stuff pretty tiresome. But I find it amazing to be walking. We were on horseback, but following the shingle from the estuary up this river, and imagining that in 18 whatever it was 34 maybe, I'm not sure if that's correct, but whenever Darwin was there, they'd been doing the same thing, and he'd been picking up these pieces of shingle and seeing fossilized sea creatures in it, and starting to have these thoughts that for the first time that maybe the world is not now as it always was, and maybe something has changed. And this was a big part of the development of his thinking. So to me that was fascinating, and to just be able to ride these horses for hundreds of kilometers along this river, to be able to drink from this river and fish in this river and live alongside it, this artery that kept us sustained, and to not encounter fences and not encounter obstacles. I mean, there are the estancias that have been there for a long time, but there's fewer and fewer of those because the market didn't sustain them anymore, and so it was a very isolated journey in lots of ways, which made it feel all the more wild. And things like that are such a great reminder of how reliant we are on the planet. When you're in a landscape like that, you realize, I mean, firstly, we realized that we were completely reliant on our horses and this bond between the five of them and the three of us. We were completely reliant on one another and those human and social relationships. And most of all, we depended on that river. Without the water from that river and without the purity of it, for everything, for all of our needs, we would not have lasted. And so it's very humbling to be in such a situation like that. And the world we live in today doesn't encourage us to be in positions like that. Everything is provided for us at all times, and we're totally disconnected from nature. And this is, I'm sure this is something you both think about a lot, and it's something I think about a lot. But the fact that we buy our food in plastic packages in the supermarket and we have no idea where it comes from, whether it's meat or vegetables or whatever else, of course it means we don't think about it and we don't understand where it comes from, and we have to work hard to care about the cost. So I think for me that was a big part of this journey. It was I've rarely felt as connected to the world around me as we did at that point in time.
The construction of the dams, I think they're now talking about completion in 2027 or 2028. So it's actually been a bit longer than was first expected. How can you describe the experience of knowing that there was going to be a massive impact on the ecosystem as a result, and how that affected your experience?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, at the time, it was all quite uncertain. We tried to we spoke to um, a few people with the most who were willing to speak to us in Buenos Aires and then also in El Calafate, and it seemed like construction was pretty imminent. And actually, when we got there, there was already some work going on. We saw some heavy machinery, some excavators. We saw some land that had been cleared, and it looked like it was going to happen within a couple of years. I mean, as it turned out, there was quite shortly after that, there was quite a surprising result in the elections, and the government changed. And so that was the first of now what's been a number of upheavals in politics in Argentina, and that put a spanner in the works, I guess. And it does seem like it's happening. It's just on a longer time frame. But I guess if I look back at what we were trying to imagine, we were looking at this pristine landscape, and it really was a pristine landscape, and just trying to imagine what that would look like when a huge proportion of it became a reservoir backed up behind a dam. And I've since done a lot of work on rivers in other parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East. And my last book was about the river Tigris, predominantly in Iraq, but it starts in Turkey and runs through northeast Syria. And the Tigris has got a huge number of dams on the headwaters, the Tigris and its sister river, the Euphrates. And most of them have been completed, almost all of them have been completed. And so that was a case of seeing things at the other end. In Turkey, there's one area called Hasankeyf, which was a very well-known town, one of the oldest continually inhabited settlements on Earth, 12,000 years of recorded human history, with hundreds of archaeological sites, plus a modern-day population who live there, and quite a well-known tourist destination. And it was flooded as part of a dam called Elisu, alongside hundreds of other archaeological sites and villages and so on. And when I visited, I never got to see it in its glory, but I saw the pictures, and instead what I saw was just this very sparse place. The inhabitants who stayed were moved to a village a couple of 100 meters up on a hillside, and it was barren and cold. And actually, the Turkish government poured a layer of concrete over much of the old town to form a stronger foundation for the dam. And the juxtaposition between what we experienced versus what had been there that was 2021 I was there, and it was 2019 that the water was released. So the juxtaposition was huge. So if I go back to the Rio Santa Cruz, that was kind of what we were looking at then, was it's almost unfathomable. You look at this, it feels like perfection when you're in the natural world like that, and you have these mountains in the distance. You've got this incredible ribbon of life in the river, and this kind of cobalt blue. You have guanacos running around. There's flamingos further upstream. There isn't a huge human population, but there are some. And then, of course, at the source of it is the Perito Moreno Glacier, which was one of the biggest impacts that was projected for this, was that raising the water level would affect the stability of the glacier. And so what we tried to do was just to look at what gets lost. And in some ways, the Rio Santa Cruz was an interesting case study, because there wasn't a huge human population that was going to be displaced. Whereas in many parts of the Middle East that I've been in, there is that element of it too. But here it was much more a case of nature versus progress, right? I mean, and maybe progress isn't the right word, because it can be defined in lots of different ways. But the growing population, the big cities of Argentina expect and can expect to live a certain quality of life and be provided with electricity to run air conditioning units and so on. That's what people have been. That's how we developed, and the expectations we have for the society we live in. But in order to get that, are we willing to destroy the last wild places on Earth in a very permanent way, in a way that can never be undone? And what is the cost of that? Because the cost is not, there's a huge intangible cost to it as well, in terms of what we lose culturally and environmentally, and beyond a cost that can be measured in dollars or pesos or
Right.
whatever.
Well, in Chile, where we're based, there also were around that same time some big hydroelectric dam projects planned for the Rio Baker and the Rio Pascua in Aysén, Patagonia. And eventually the people mobilized and were able to stop it.
That's fascinating, yeah. And that was a big source of inspiration to the activists and environmentalists that we met in Argentina at the time, was that these projects like this have been stopped elsewhere, and over time, it's often shown to be exactly as you say. It's fear mongering, and it's never just about the benefits that are told, right? There's always the untold side of it, and the economic value to whoever might be benefiting from that.
Is that an issue in the Middle East, hydroelectric dams?
Yeah, it's huge, and it's been particularly huge where I've been based for the last 4.5 years, in the Kurdistan region in the north of Iraq. But largely the whole of Mesopotamia was the name that the Greeks gave to this area, meaning the land between two rivers. And these days that roughly translates as it's mostly Iraq, but it's parts of Syria, it's parts of Turkey, and reaches out towards Iran. But it's the floodplain that the Tigris and the Euphrates irrigate, and those two rivers. A very, very brief history in about 60 seconds is that 12,000 years ago, humans were living as hunter-gatherers up in the mountains, the Taurus Mountains in Turkey and the Zagros Mountains, they're now in Iran. But they could see this floodplain down below, and so over the course of about 4,000 years, they slowly began to move down and abandon the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle and start to work with these rivers. and experiment with crop planting and animal husbandry. And as that was successful over the next 4,000 years, they moved further south still, and at the areas on the banks of the river where their experiments were most productive, people gathered in greater and greater numbers, and those became the first settlements, the first cities in the world. And from that, we got the world's first civilizations. The first written word came from there, and then the world's first universities and legal systems and sailing boats, and the first beer was brewed, and the first love songs were written, and the first possibly I can go on, but anyway, lots of really wonderful things came from that point in time, and now we're at a point where those two rivers that quite literally irrigated the earliest civilizations and have left an imprint on how we live our lives today have been dammed almost to the point at which they no longer flow to their conclusion. Both the Tigris and the Euphrates are predicted by perhaps 2040 to no longer reach the Gulf. And there's a few factors to that. Poor governance of the waterways within the countries that they flow through. Climate change is a factor, although it's actually a lesser factor than some of the others, and a lack of effective water sharing agreements between the countries that they run through. And so Turkey is undergoing severe water shortages and is holding back a huge amount of the water of the Tigris and Euphrates. So the Tigris in particular last year received 60% less water into Iraq than it did in 2015. And that's just not sustainable for the people who live there. So these are huge issues without, I mean, in the Middle East, everyone's been talking about oil for the last 70 years, but now they're talking about water. And that's what everything from, every aspect of life will revolve around that. And I think it's probably the same where you are too. Water is becoming increasingly understood as this resource which we can't just do whatever we like with.
Right. I mean, you did a book about the Tigris, right?
I did, yeah. Which took about 4 and a bit years to produce, and then came out last year.
What did you learn in doing that book about how the river has affected these communities?
I mean, I think the biggest, it's affected people in so many different ways, and I think that's probably true for a lot of places. Of course, it's a lifeline. It's quite literally the source of people's sustenance. So, Iraq is, from those early days until now, has predominantly relied on agriculture, and much of the country is made up of pastoralists and people who fish for a living. And so if the river no longer flows or is poisoned, or it affects those people. And that's happening at a terrifyingly quick rate, and the country really is on an environmental precipice with that. But the river also has a huge cultural impact too, and I know Iraq and the Tigris well from this work, but I'm sure the same is true for many other places. You look at literature, you look at the arts, you look at songs and poetry, and so often when they come from cities and communities that are along rivers and countries through which rivers are an integral part of their story, people write about these things. Rivers are the basis for a lot of cultural understanding. And so it's absolutely true in Iraq. Everyone feels they have a connection to it, and and even in practical ways too. All of the major cities are built on the banks of a river. So from Mosul to Baghdad to Basra, the river cuts right through the middle of these famous historic cities, and people understand them as almost a foundational element of where they come from.
Is the river polluted, or what is the current situation?
Yeah, I mean, the Tigris is a really sad story. It's kind of an example of what happens if you take, how could I put this? I mean, Iraq is not like a lot of other countries in the Middle East. I'm in Jordan right now. Jordan is one of the most water scarce countries on earth. It may even be the most. It's certainly in the top three or bottom three, whichever way you look at it. There's just very little water in Jordan. The Jordan River is running dry. The underground aquifers are historically low levels. There's very little rainfall. Lots of other countries in this region have a similar story. Iraq shouldn't. Iraq has got these two incredible rivers, and also got a mountainous region in the north with rainfall that feeds into tributaries that feed these rivers. Iraq should not be a water poor country, and yet it is. And it's because at every possible point, in every possible way, the river has been damaged. So from the dams to illegal construction of gravel mines that dig out the bed of the river, to anything and everything being dumped into the water itself, from the oil refineries to factories to just city waste, to a lack of any upgrade on water infrastructure for farmers, to really archaic farming methods. Like many of the farmers in Iraq still use these methods of irrigation from 5,000 years ago that the Sumerians were using, like flood irrigation, which is very wasteful. It's not the farmers' fault; they just can't afford to upgrade. They've just got no support from the government, and in some ways, the Iraqi government, they can't be excused for it because there's huge levels of corruption going on and lack of care for this. But a lot of this came from 2003, and after the invasion of Iraq, the entire system of the country was gutted, and none of it was replaced, and it left this massive gap, and so the country has never recovered from that. So the river, every possible way you could imagine a river suffering, that's the Tigris, and yet it still flows, and yet people still rely on it, and so on. It's amazing that it does, but there's yeah there can't be many rivers in the world that are undergoing as much of an assault as the Tigris is.
You floated the entire river, right? You-
Yeah, that was the plan anyway. A team of five of us started at the source. We made it to the sea after about 80 days, I think.
yeah,
It's about 1,200 miles, 2,000 kilometers. We used local boats and local boat owners for most of it. In some sections, the security was tricky, so whenever it got very tricky, we sometimes navigated around, but we were on the water for the vast majority of it.
yeah. So you've been in Kurdistan since 2017, is that right? In Iraq, and
Yeah, so I started going kind of end of 2016, 2017. I was going in and out, and then I moved there in 2019.
how are you dealing with the security issues? I mean, how do you spend a lot of time? I know that you involved in setting up the Zagros Mountain Trail. Is that right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, what's it like to are you scared when you go out in the wilderness there and that something could happen?
Um, I no, I'm not, but only because I have had the privilege of getting to know the place really well and understand that um, there isn't really much to be scared of. I mean, there are a couple of things to be scared of, which I'll come to in a second, but in general, my impressions of Iraq from a distance were the same as most people's, until I went there and understood that these mountains, which were the reason I decided to go and live there, are just phenomenally beautiful. In the Kurdistan region, which is a semi-autonomous region, 65 to 70% of it is mountainous. And you've got huge river valleys and canyons and waterfalls and snow-capped peaks in the east, and it's incredibly beautiful, and thousands of years of history that have adapted around those mountains. So to walk in them is just such a, I mean, it's amazing. I can't believe it. Sometimes it's such a privilege, and that was where the idea of the trail came from, was to create something that was a kind of container or a platform to allow others to walk there as well, whether they be people from inside the region or people from outside, and to bring people together and create an economic opportunity for those who live these rural areas, and to make it sustainable, and to help create corridors of environmental protection along that as well. So it had lots and lots of aims. But to go back to your question, and to think about this in terms of the wildness of it, which is, of course, its great appeal alongside the, where that kind of intersects with the hospitality and the culture. This is a scarred and damaged landscape. It's a landscape that has seen decades of conflict, and prior to that, many more as well. And it still wears some of that pretty heavily. So some of that is now part of the story of the wilderness. So some of the guides on this trail that we've developed are Peshmerga, which is the kind of Kurdish military force, and most of them are retired Peshmerga now. But when Saddam Hussein in Iraq was carrying out his genocidal campaigns against the Kurds and destroying entire settlements, he destroyed 3,000 to 4,000 entire towns, and trying to wipe or drive out the Kurds. These guys, as young men and young women, survived by hiding in the mountains, and fought by hiding in the mountains. So some of the trails that we use are the trails that they use to stay alive. And as one of the guides on the trail, Ahmed Razani, told us in the early days of scouting it, he said, the beauty of this project to him is that it turned the mountains from a place of refuge into a place of recreation. And so that reimagining of it is what inspired me to spend so many years working on this. But there are things that are harder to shake off, and one of those is the presence of landmines that were left behind by Saddam Hussein, and also on the Iran-Iraq border. And the trail that we've created stays clear of those, but they're a blight on the landscape. There are huge areas of these incredibly beautiful mountains. If you saw them from the air, if you see them from a distance, it looks as pristine, as perfect as Patagonia. When I first went there, you get up close, you realize that there's entire sections. Some of the areas are marked with signs from the 80s that say there are mines here. Some of them aren't. Some of the mines, the signs have disappeared over the time, but the shepherds know not to go there because it was never cleared. And so you see there's something deeply kind of metaphorical, but also just intensely depressing about seeing the most perfect hillside you can imagine, especially in spring, lush green grass and wildflowers and everything else, and knowing that you can't go there because under the ground are these instruments of death and devastation. And so I think that's, a lot of my work, a lot of my life in the last decade and a half has been spent looking at ways in which humans screw up beautiful places. And it is really demoralizing, but equally there's also lots of ways in which we can undo that or do positive things too. So without dragging it on too much, maybe I'll just finish on that by saying that I think the Zagros Mountain Trail has kind of been a case study for us in when damage is being done, how do you then create something new on top of that creates a better, more positive version of the future that people want to live in, and that respects and rehabilitates the wilderness.
And so, are you seeing more tourism coming now?
It's slow. The trail's up and running. All the information's online. The way it runs at the minute is still people hire local guides, stay with local homestays. I mean, the Kurdish region in northern Iraq, it's probably going to be a niche destination for a while. It's going to take a little while before, people are kind of looking at the Appalachian Trail or the Kurdish region of Iraq. But that's fine. I mean, it's anyone who comes sees what a great place it is. There's also a big local hiking community that use these trails, and it grows slowly, it grows sustainably, and the important thing is that the people who use it enjoy it, and that the people who live along it feel like they own it and get that interaction with people who come from elsewhere. So yeah, slowly, it's coming to life.
How would you compare it to other places, other wild places around the world?
I think it's equally beautiful. I mean, I've learned my lesson over the years of ever trying to rank beautiful places because it just you know everything is joint first for me after a
Right.
while. But it's it's spectacular. It has a lot of diversity in the landscape. Um, and the hiking is great. I mean, it is a mountain trail. It's up and down and up and down. Uh, but in spring, with the wildflowers and the greenery, and in autumn with the changing of the season and the colors of the leaves, um, it's it's unbelievable.
You're involved in Kurdistan. There's a hikers community there. Have you found that in other places in the Middle East?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think oftentimes where there's mountains, where there's beautiful landscapes, people have a relationship to that. I mean, in the Middle East, there's definitely a culture of people going to the mountains, to the green wild places, and having picnics and being connected to that place. And um, in Kurdistan and also, in Jordan and in the West Bank, there's been hiking communities that have grown, and the understanding of hiking as it's seen in the Western world sometimes takes a while to catch on that it's this sort of recreational thing, and um, but it often meets in the middle, and there's kind of a nice version to that too.
How would you, have you been good part of the world now? What are some takeaways you have from all your experiences on wild places?
I think I've learned to never underestimate the power of wild places and the importance of wild places. We talk all the time about um, the protection of wild places mentioned in that, and it's for very practical reasons. Environmentally, it's essential that we do so and protect our water resources and so on. But also just for our own minds and for our own relationship here. It's really important that we do that. So um, I think that has been the key takeaway to me, to never underestimate the power of wilderness, and to never underestimate to never take it for granted, because it really is under threat and always will be, and so it needs champions. It needs champions like you, it needs champions like me. It needs everyone doing everything they can to protect it.
So today we have with us Jimena Martinez Astroza, also known as Nina. She's a photojournalist, permaculturist, and urban farmer. Yeah, why don't you, just to start us out here, can you tell us a little bit about your article and what it was about? Just sort of a brief overview.
Yes, I did write this article because I didn't want to lose all the memories that I did have from this travel. I lost my camera, and I am a photojournalist. So imagine, like, your whole identity, it's being like lost, or I don't know. So how I was going to be in the presence of this magnificent nature phenomenon without my camera. One thing that I want to say before to start this space is I want to acknowledge the traditional elders of the land where I'm living today, which is the 5 tribes of Kulin Nation here in Australia. This should be a thing that we use in our every day's life. We have to acknowledge the people who was here before, and they use traditional knowledge to take care of this land.
Yeah. So, that brings to a really good point what you just said. In your article, you talk a lot about Icelandic culture, and its relationship to nature. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, just from what you saw, even outside of the parks?
Yeah, I think nature for them, it's in their veins. And this is something that we as maybe Latin American or American people thinking in the whole continent, we have been missing because of the Western culture, which is so strong and don't put in value our roots. But Vikings are Vikings. No one's colonized them. They are very settled in their truth. They love their culture. And for example, I did have a friend, a Chilean friend, who was married with an Icelandic guy. He's a scientist, and I think my love for Iceland started by then. But they have a kid, and the name of the kid is Wolf in Icelandic, which is Ulfur. So it's very common for them name the people with elements from nature. Like, would you believe it? So because we have the names in our culture is like Maria, Jose, I don't know, Ricardo, Pedro. I don't know where that comes from, but mostly of them, of course, are from like religions. But where is our traditions? Like, I would love to know more actually about, for example, our roots in Chile. I just becoming my awakening traveling, and I've been so mesmerized for their connection with nature. And one day I will come back to Latin America to know more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you wrote this story about your journey, your mission to try to see Northern Lights again. And so I sort of had two questions for that. When was the first time that you saw them? And two, when you finally did see them, what was that like?
That's a really good question, because was the whole motif, like motto, for the travel. The first time that I saw the Northern Lights was in Norway. I traveled with two other Chilean friends. We were living in Denmark, and we traveled all the way to northern territory in Norway, to a city called Tromsø. And we were in the middle of winter, and we were just too excited. I didn't sleep the first night, just waiting. We have a beautiful rented unit that was looking at a fjord and mountains in Tromsø. So it was unbelievable. I didn't sleep the first night. We didn't saw it. And at the other day, we just opened the door and we said like, oh, let's go for a walk and maybe we will see Aurora Borealis here. And I remember I did open the door and I was talking with my friends, and then I moved my head around and Aurora was there, was in front of my eyes, was on top of my head. And it's like a universe bath. And three of us, we started crying. It's like, oh, this emotion that you cannot explain. It's magical. It's a magical moment. And I love nature, and I feel really connected with nature. I'm a communicator and a journalist, and I'm always struggling how to communicate these like feelings and human experiences. But sometimes I realized you cannot just express it. So I did take some pictures from Tromsø experience, and I did an article that was published in Outside Magazine. So if you want to are keen to know more about it, the whole story is there. And when I travel and when I went to Tromsø, we saw the Northern Lights every single day. And versus when I went to Iceland, following the same forecast, I saw the Northern Lights once, and was very low, or was very like far away. It wasn't that intense like in Tromsø. And I was like even up north, so I thought it would be in the other way around the experience. But I didn't see the northern lights. And then nature taught me another thing again. It's wild. You cannot control it. Even if we are the smartest beings on earth because we create the forecast. No. Nature does her own thing. Mother Nature and Mother Earth and the universe. We are many machines of the universe, but I think we lost connection. We have to tune again into the universe vibration and try to understand the things, not necessarily with words. And I think something maybe that I could add to my article in the future, it maybe try to be less journalist and more human to do the writing. But in the end, everything is connection.
Yeah. So your article, you talk about, your journey to Iceland, all that you went through trying to see these northern lights, trying to photograph them, what it's like in Iceland, their culture a little bit. Was there anything that you didn't include in your article that you also thought was interesting or funny or, whatever it might be that just didn't make it in for whatever reason?
Yeah, actually, in one of the tours, we did have a tour guide that was talking about Christmas, because it's in the article that when you go around the downtown, you can see a big mailbox and a Christmas shop, and it's open all the year. And we don't understand pretty much Santa's story and all the Christmas in winter, because we are in South America now. I'm living in Australia, and we have Christmas in summer, so it's quite the same. But by then, I didn't really understand, just because I did live Christmas when I was in Copenhagen, so I could get quite some of the stories about Christmas and Santa and the cold. But then the tour guide said a story when she was a child. So she said, when you have a bad behavior, when you are a kid, in Christmas, you get a sock, which is like, let's talk like 15 years ago, they did use socks, like that was true, to hang instead wrap things or gifts. They used to use socks and they hang them next to the fire inside of the house, like next to the fireplace. And if you have a bad behavior, you will get potatoes. If you have a good behavior, you will get fruits and possible candies, and in the better case, like a little chocolate. But because this is island, is so far away, everything is imported, so makes totally sense. Even fruits are hard to get there. Like everything is imported. They mostly have like greenies. So that was fun to know. Like, oh, imagine now kids have like several and very fancy gifts, but before it was a sock with potatoes. And she did have, the funny story is, she did have a sock one year with potatoes, but she came at night and she changed the potatoes for oranges, like the only two oranges that they did have in the house. And the parents says the other day, like, oh, you got oranges. I'm surprised because you didn't really behave this year. And she was like, oh my God, I'm so happy because I got oranges. But she changed them. She was cheating. And of course, the parents knew.
That's so funny. That's amazing.
But that's funny.
Great.
And
Wonderful.
one thing that I would love to highlight. Then I went to Iceland, and after I went to Iceland, I thought this is my favorite place in the world, because the culture is very connected with the land. Is they are very conscious of the impact in the city about every policy that they have. Everything in Iceland is a national park, counts as a national park, and is protected, and is part of the culture, and it has a story, and it's put in value. So I thought, oh, this is my favorite place in the world. And after that, I came back at some point at Chile, and for first time I went to Patagonia. And I thought, oh my God, wait a minute. How big is my ignorance? Then I didn't know Patagonia before, and I thought Iceland is like the best system, the most beautiful landscape that I've ever seen. Patagonia is incredible. Chile is amazing. We have everything, but we don't put it in value. We don't protect it. We don't care. Everything is highly privatized, is capitalized for private companies or private individuals, and these need to change because land and ecosystems doesn't belong to us. We don't own it. That's a new concept from, you can call it capitalism, neoliberalism, but we have to come back to the thinking that we are the custodians of the land. We are here to take care of it for future generations. And something that I would love to create consciousness about is of that we have a beautiful country. We need to own it. We need to embody it, and we need to protect it. And we can do this creating consciousness from the school, talking with our friends about it, and making an opinion about it. This is not something that just a government will fix in the future. This is our duty because we are living in this earth, in this land, and we have to do it with joy because we came to this earth to take care of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great sentiment. And I think it's really unique to hear that perspective, as a Chilean who just maybe came to know Patagonia a little bit later in their life, and see, the beauty that is here and in the land. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that, you sharing that perspective with us.
Published in print and digital since 2011, Patagon Journal is a bilingual magazine in English and Spanish about Patagonia and the world's last wild places. Head to our website, patagonjournal.com, where you can find our magazine and read our online articles. To subscribe, support our work through our special premium membership program, or buy back issues, merch and more, visit our online store at patagonstore.com. Any suggestions or to contribute stories to the magazine, get in touch with us by email at editors@patagonjournal.com.